While I'm obligated to refer to my notes here this evening, I will try to look up from time to time to give it an appropriate feeling of spontaneity, and I will try not to have the look of total surprise that used to come over Ronald Reagan's face when he would be reading from his prepared speeches. One of the appeals of Thomas Jefferson and his grip on the American imagination has been his enigmatic, paradoxical, seductive qualities that we all know about. And quite often, these paradoxes turn out to be downright contradictions. My friend Joe Ellis, in his recent biography, calls Jefferson the American Sphinx, and Joe even suggestively singles out Jefferson's poetic appeal, particularly to American poets, 20th century poets, such as Robert Frost and Robert Penn Warren and Ezra Pound. And I don't know of any other president that has attracted that kind of presidential, poetic attention. There's something about Jefferson's complex, at times puzzling character that has inspired not only poets, but historians and novelists and bad filmmakers that exceeds all the other presidents combined. And recently the heat has been turned up, I think you must know, turned up on Jefferson as the national hero. He's been portrayed by some historians and writers as a national disgrace, a hypocrite who refused to free his slaves. Notoriously, some claim that he kept his slave, Sally Hemings, as his concubine, both in Paris and later at Monticello, a charge that's been around since the presidential campaign of 1800 and still unresolved. At this late date, it seems to me a kind of non-issue, but one that has captured the popular attention, and in particular the imagination of many undergraduates. In my opinion, it will never be resolved short of a DNA test. And I have at least 3 Jefferson descendants who are prepared to donate the appropriate body parts to carry out that test. The Irish politician and writer Conor Cruise O'Brien, in an Irish flight of vitriolic fantasy, I can only characterize it as that, went so far as to attempt to connect Jefferson's faith in individual liberty. Somehow he tried to make this connection between his faith in individual liberty and the bombing in Oklahoma City. You have to read the book to believe this charge. That Jefferson's reputation, personality, and principles can stir up such a debate at this late date is, I think, a tribute to the man and his enduring legacy. But making the case for the defense is not my particular concern this evening. The particular paradox and contradiction that has attracted me to Thomas Jefferson most recently and prompted me to write the book that Bob so kindly mentioned in his introduction is that while Jefferson is the quintessential agrarian, the passionate lover of the rural life, the most conspicuous, outspoken critic of the city, rejecting urban life and particularly the European city as utterly incompatible with his vision of American democracy, he was to actually spend the happiest 5 years of his life in the fabled city of Paris. What was then, and in my opinion, and I know it is of the opinion of the Dean, the greatest city in the world. And I would like then to call my remarks this evening, the title, The Ambivalent Urbanite. And I think we all suffer from a little of that ambivalence sometimes. In his only book that he wrote in his lifetime called The Notes on the State of Virginia, largely written before he'd ever seen Paris or ever seen a city. I think the largest city he had ever seen was Philadelphia, and it had maybe 20,000 souls. Jefferson had famously declared, nevertheless, without having seen a major city, that cities were a carbuncle on the body politic of democracy. Cities were centers of irredeemable corruption, a terminal condition where those qualities of American independence and values would inevitably disappear or be throttled before they could take root in American soil. Here's one of the many thundering indictments of the city, and if we can say Jefferson, the Virginia gentleman, ever thundered, but here's what he said: "The mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as sores do to the strength of the human body." Can't get stronger than that. Jefferson's attitude and anti-urban sentiment, it would become a part, of course, of the Jefferson legacy, or the Jeffersonian ideology, I should say, later becoming ingrained in the American character, particularly among intellectuals, persists down to the present time, and I think is reflected to a certain extent in the manifestations of the most extreme points of view of the environmental movement. Beginning with Jefferson and his vision of a nation of small, freedom-loving farmers, a vision built on regularly, in spite of the contradictions of reality throughout much of our national experience, this deep, persistent prejudice is at the heart of American individualism. I should also add that few scholars accept this Jeffersonian bias as relevant in our industrialized urban America at the end of the 20th century. Jefferson, the Puritan, the innocent provincial from the American wilderness discovering Europe, of course, is a great literary theme that we're all familiar with. We think of Hawthorne, of Edith Wharton, of F. Scott Fitzgerald. To state the theme baldly, I almost said badly, but I think my notes say baldly here, the moral and physical environment of the city undermine mankind's liberty and humanity. Simple as that. By its very nature, the city offends the eye, the ear, the spirit. It lacks order, structure, history, and dignity. Fear of the city, in these terms, has been our most common national attitude. Sort of binds us all together, I think. The present decay of the American city is a monument to this, its national rejection, and the reverse side of it is, of course, the suburban sprawl that surrounds the monument. There is also a link in this general disposition towards cities to American attitudes to private morality. And here again, we can turn to Jefferson on this. While Jefferson loved French architecture and the city itself and so on, he was, to put it mildly, dismayed by what he thought were the Parisian lack of moral standards, and particularly marital infidelity. Regularly recording his disapproval of the conduct of his French friends with their conspicuous lovers and mistresses. And he held the suspicion that city life had something to do with this decline and fall. He was, of course, outvoted by his two fellow Americans, Benjamin Franklin and Gouverneur Morris, who completely disagreed with him on this, never debated it with him, just simply disagreed with him, and demonstrated it by being much more of the French persuasion when it came to these matters than Jefferson could ever do in his high-minded Puritanism. Having observed the Virginian at close range during his 5 years in Paris between 1784 and 1789, I would agree with Henry Adams when he wrote in his History of the Jefferson Administration, and this is sort of the key to my argument tonight and underlines the argument in the book itself, that with all of his extraordinary versatility of character and opinion, Jefferson seemed during his entire life to breathe with perfect satisfaction nowhere else except in the liberal, literary, and scientific air of Paris. This, of course, means that I have to ignore or just sweep under the carpet all of those other quotes of Jefferson that you heard me give at the beginning. To test Adams's conclusion and the paradox in our popular perception of Jefferson, let me review quickly the high points of his life measured in terms of what we know of his personal, intellectual, aesthetic, and emotional satisfaction and happiness in key periods of his life. When he was appointed to Paris in 1784, he was living at Monticello. He'd returned there after the Revolution and spent the next 2 years after the Revolution brooding and smarting over the fact that many of his fellow Virginians did not think he did a very good job as the governor of the state, as war governor. And he narrowly escaped public censure by his political enemies. He was also a depressed 41-year-old widower with 3 small daughters living in the remote edge of the former Virginia colony, where only an occasional visitor, hopefully from Europe, would drop in to rekindle his interest in literature, in architecture, music, and landscape design. It is true that his 12 years of married life during the building of the first Monticello seems to have been a period of perfect domestic bliss, although it was certainly marred by the death of 3 of his children and the chronic illness of his wife. And there was in this rustic Arcadia a certain lack of cultural and intellectual stimulation documented by his repeated efforts to attract cultivated foreign visitors for long visits or even for short ones. At that time, right during the Revolution, there happened to be a prisoner camp of British prisoners in the neighborhood, and I think he was really so desperate for company and intellectual stimulation that he actually invited some of the British officer prisoners over to fill in his string quartets on the weekends. He also asked his good friend Filippo Mazzai from Tuscany, who was engaged in setting up a wine operation, a vineyard at Monticello in partnership with Jefferson. They were going to recruit all of the skilled workmen from Italy, and Jefferson writes Mazzai and says that in addition to their skills in the vineyards, he would like to have them each have some skill in music so that they would then be available to play in his orchestra in residence. In 1784, Jefferson was also smarting. This was just before he went off to Paris, but he was still, 10 years later, he was still smarting and would smart for the rest of his life for what he considered from what he would consider the mutilating editing by his colleagues in Philadelphia in July of 1786, which they delivered to his draft of the Declaration of Independence, making it, in his very thin-skinned opinion, something far less than what he intended. He really brooded over this one. And when we look at the post-Paris years, it is hard to find any extended periods of satisfaction, to use the words of Henry Adams. In late 1789, when he came back from Europe, he thought he was going to be back for 6 months and then return to Paris, but instead he discovered that he had been tapped to be the Secretary of State, and so he would spend the next 3 years battling Alexander Hamilton in Washington's cabinet, and he was fighting with, of course, the Federalists, who he was convinced were going to destroy him and the American Republic. And he resigns from that post and retreats back to Monticello. And the only happy moments, I believe, was working with L'Enfant on the initial plans for the federal city, the new capital of Washington. Jefferson's term as John Adams as vice president and 8 years as president was a protracted political inferno, ending in genuine bitterness, summed up in a letter Jefferson wrote to his friend Pierre Dupont in 1808, a few weeks before he left the White House. Within a few days, I retire to my family, my books and farms, and having gained the harbor myself, I shall look on my friends still buffeting the storm with anxiety indeed, but not with envy. Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such a relief as I shall of shaking off the shackles of power. On his return to Monticello, of course, Jefferson was saddled with a huge debt on the property and a condition that would haunt him all of his life, although in Paris he managed to somehow ignore it. It was true that he owned some 200 slaves and large plantations in Virginia, but the operation, of course, had suffered from the usual fate of absentee management. And after the presidency, he slips into old age, bankruptcy, and all kinds of family problems, enlightened only occasionally, I think, by memories of Paris. Those memories are summed up in his first letter recording the beginnings of his love affair with France, and particularly Parisian life. Were I to proceed to tell you, he wrote a friend in Williamsburg, how much I enjoy their architecture, sculpture, painting, music, I should want words. It is in these arts they shine. Before he went to Paris, Jefferson, of course, had studied the arts secondhand. He'd learned to play the violin, and he had, by his own work and his library, had become a self-taught architect in the great English gentleman's school of building, but without having seen a single example or a major work. He also developed a critical eye for architecture that he had sharpened exclusively from books and from practical experience. It would be safe to say that he was our first architectural critic. In his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson concluded that the architecture of Virginia was beyond redeeming, claiming that the genius of architecture seemed to have shed its maledictions over the land. The buildings of Williamsburg, he wrote, were rude, misshapen piles, which, but for the fact that they had roofs, would be taken for brick kilns. And he said it was also fortunate that they were all built of timber, since the fire would shortly dispose of them, and they could get on with something else. It's obviously no wonder that he didn't publish his notes in Virginia, but waited till he got to Paris to unleash this attack. When Jefferson arrived in the cosmopolitan city of Paris, of course, in the fall of 1784, the rather stunned countryman from the sticks of Virginia, I should say, found himself in the middle of the unquestioned cultural capital of the Western world. And during his 5 years in Paris, the profound revolutionary changes in the arts, in architecture, in city planning, would anticipate the promise of political change that was to follow the upheavals of the revolutionary decades on both sides of the Atlantic. And aside from his pleasure as a growing connoisseur of painting, sculpture, good food, fine wines, beautiful, intelligent women, and liberated women, I might say, he also proclaimed himself to be philosophically an Epicurean. It was the new city of Paris and its architecture, I think, that stirred his innermost passions. So let me give you an impressionistic tour of the city and look at a few of the key developments that not only attracted Jefferson's eye, but the eye of every visitor. This thread of architectural interest is as good as a test as any other in proving my thesis that Paris, in all of its physical and cultural riches, provided the most perfect air of satisfaction Jefferson would ever know. We will now have our first slide. Have the lights off. Good, glad to get that. Can we come down more? Yes, good. We're looking here, of course, at a map of 1787, perfect stage set for our purposes this evening. Is this on there? We're looking here at the map, and it was really done by the Chamber of Commerce of Paris, because what they wanted to show was what had happened over the last 600 or 700 years. Here in the middle, they've carefully outlined where the first mud huts were huddled together here on the island, the Ile de Saint Louis, in the middle of the river. And then the next line shows the expansion of fortifications moving out in the 16th and 17th century here. And then, lo and behold, it's 1787, and we see where Paris has now expanded. This is the new wall, or the outline, the line, the city limits of the city, expanding all the way to the Étoile up here on the west, to the Bastille down here at this point. It's really a breathtaking development when you think about it. The city had by the time Jefferson arrived, had some 600,000, a population of some 600,000. This population was distributed equally on the east-west axis on both sides of the river, reaching, as I say, from the Bastille on the east to the Étoile on the west. Major new boulevards were being cut in through the old medieval parts of the city. The bridges, which had been encrusted with houses over the centuries, were cleared, and it really is 100 years before Haussmann in terms of the way things were going during this period. Even the notorious Bastille, which is, of course, to come down in July of 1789, was slated, actually, to be pulled down in the name of urban renewal, urban renewal, I always say urban renewal, and 10 years before the Revolution. The heart of Jefferson's Paris, this is the Bastille, as you know. The heart of Jefferson's Paris was, of course, the great, what we know, the Place de la Concorde, or known then as the Place Louis XV, designed by Gabriel, and it just had been completed in the 1760s, just a few years before Jefferson arrived. Jefferson was so impressed by it that he actually bought some engravings of Gabriel's facades here on this side of the point which you most clearly recognize from as it appears today. Of course, you could imagine what the traffic patterns would be like if these islands, these plantings, were still there. It actually was a wonderful sort of entry gate to the city, and Jefferson's house, which was just to the west of it, up the hill, he actually tells us the exact distance. He stepped it off one day, double-stepped 876 steps from his house down to the Place. And in noting that, you can almost feel his enthusiasm for being there in the city and having this the pleasure of walking here to this great space nearly every day. He said he walked some 3 to 5 miles a day every day that he was in Paris. I should also single out another and even newer landmark, or I should say series of landmarks in the development of Paris in the late 18th century, setting the city's new boundaries as we saw in the map. This was the new tax wall, built literally as a fortified wall to collect taxes, to be collected through these beautiful little temples designed by Claude Nicolas Ledoux. This one here is one of the four, I believe the four that have survived. It's called the Barrière de la Villette. Now this project, just to add a little glamour to it, was carried out by very much by this man here, the Marquis Lavoisier, who was a great friend of Jefferson. But he also happened to be one of the tax collectors, the private tax collectors that actually had the contract with the government. So he obviously stood to benefit quite handsomely from this building of the barrières. But of course, poor Ledoux didn't fully appreciate the political implications of this wall that he was building, and there was a number of scandals involved with it, and he was fired. And I think it really blighted his career. Here in 1789, of course, the anger of the mob was turned squarely on these buildings. Here they're burning one of them, an early example of, what shall we say, deconstruction. It was burned on July the 12th, 1789. It happened to be the same day that Jefferson writes his friend Maria Cosway in London, telling her that the waving of heads at the end of a pike had suddenly become a la mode in Paris. The town was really a boom town, and it reminds me, in the description of it and what was going on, reminds me of a recent visit to the city of Berlin. There was putting up and pulling down, to use Jefferson's phrase, in all directions. And Jefferson loved it, even though, and it seemed again to somehow contradict his regular claims that the quiet, tranquil life of the study and the library, the peaceful pursuits of the literary scholar at Monticello were his true and natural taste and feeling of well-being. With the expansion of Paris and the new money in the hands of people like Lavoisier and other enlightened developers opening up new subdivisions, the city produced a remarkable new generation of architects. We can all name some of them. Ledoux we've already mentioned, Boulay, all of those visionary architects, Charles Grand, who actually designed Jefferson's own house, Victor Louis, who designed the great theater Bordeaux. This drawing here, I think it may be unique among architectural drawings, a drawing of a building in the 18th century actually under construction. I don't really know of any other quite like it. I found it in its abstraction quite beautiful and wanted to share it with you. Another building, this facade may be more familiar to you. This is the Hotel Guimard, a pavilion in the neighborhood of Jefferson's first house, and it also was designed by Ledoux, and it was designed for a famous actress figure in the opera. Her name was Mademoiselle Guimard, and it was actually paid for and commissioned by her lover. Jefferson may have recalled its facade when he was designing Pavilion 9 at the University of Virginia. There has been some speculation on that. Jefferson's own house, the Hotel de Langeac, was also in the form of a small pavilion or villa, and like the Hotel Guimard, was built for the mistress of a nobleman, the Marquis de Langeac. These small pleasure villas represented a manifesto of the new sensibilities of the age, in which we see a regularized, freestanding, idealized void concealing a quite asymmetrical, surprising interior, actually the antithesis of Palladio in their division and rift between the public image and the private accommodation within. And I think that this idea suggests something of the spatial idea that Jefferson played with when he returned from Paris, as he began to develop his second version of Monticello, in spite of his regular platitudes taken from the Gospel of André Palladio. Another important new house, still there on the left. This is, of course, Monticello, and giving you something of the idea of what my point that I just made. But another house that Jefferson was absolutely enthralled with is the Hotel de Somme, and we happen to have, again, a picture of a house under construction exactly at the time that Jefferson was sitting on the other side of the river every day in the Tuileries Gardens, straining his neck, he said. He said he got a stiff neck watching this work going on this house, and he became violently smitten with the results. And here, on the opposite side of the river facade, is this wonderful entrance to the house. This is on the actually now on the Rue de Lille. It's a great triumphal arch. The photograph, we photographed it through the arch, which you don't see, but it opens into this absolutely splendid courtyard in the form of a Roman colonnade. And it's another facade that Jefferson noted down to be used as reference, as a model, possibly, for public buildings when he got back to the United States and to the new republic. Another innovative public building in Paris at the time that had just been built was this new domed rotunda called the Halle aux Blés. It's built as a grain market. You see the stone structure at the base, and on top was a marvelous dome constructed out of light wooden ribs holding the glass. It was a building that everyone was absolutely astounded with, and Jefferson was so taken with this design that he repeatedly badgered Benjamin Latrobe later when he became president in the building of Washington. I think there are at least 3 buildings which Jefferson insisted that Latrobe attempt to use, and of course Latrobe said, well, if we do this, we'll have nothing but leaky roofs, and he just refused. But of course that meant nothing to Jefferson, because the roofs at Monticello have leaked ever since they were built. They still, I think, are leaking. It's always been a problem. But this building is quite wonderful, and there's something about it. I think it's both aesthetically and the utilitarian idea of being something as basic as the grain market really captured Jefferson's imagination. While the Halle aux Blés has been replaced, the other great public space in Paris that Jefferson knew, and one that was really a landmark, of course, was the rebuilding of the Palais Royal. It was really the vibrating, another center, really, another public space, sort of pendant to the Place de la Concorde. This massive facelift, which was actually carried out in the 1780s, was carried out by the Duc d'Orléans to make the old family palace profitable. So what he did was to really completely redesign it and turn it into what I would say was really the first modern shopping mall. I don't know any other way to describe it, and I don't know anything earlier than that. It was a great financial success. There were shops all around it. I think there are 3 photographs, by the way, in the exhibition that have more details of this, the galleries that ran around the central garden there that you see in this aerial photograph. It had shops below, there were clubs, there were restaurants, there were bordellos, there were gambling joints. It was really a lively place, and of course, when the revolution came along, it was the place where much of the revolutionary activity and debate took place in this space. It was also where the head of the governor of the Bastille was displayed after the Bastille fell in July of 1789. Aside from buildings to house the new unprecedented Republican forms of government in the late 18th century and early 19th century, I always have to remind myself that Jefferson's own design for the capital of the state of Virginia was the first building to be built exclusively for a Republican form of government. But aside from struggling with that new type, I would say public theaters also uniquely called for a new radical kind of public space and required a new architecture. And here we see the facade of the Odeon Theater in Paris. There's a little background. Before 1750, and with the exception of churches, architectures to serve strictly public purposes for any kind, including the theater, was extremely rare. There was, of course, the great palaces, most of them with limited access, except perhaps for Versailles and the gardens of Versailles, which were, from the time that it was built by Louis XIV, was open to the public on certain days and so on, but nevertheless, it did become a kind of public property to that extent. Theaters were almost exclusively reserved for the court, and they were housed in improvised spaces within the palaces themselves. These theaters were, for the most part, limited in access except to the court and for the gratin at the top of the social souffle. It was not until the closing decades of the old regime of the 18th century that the elite and popular taste converged on the theater as a prototype building, public building, designed to serve 2 worlds. And I think to dramatize that, we can just mention that significantly Abigail Adams, the wife of the minister to Paris, and the Queen, Marie Antoinette, both enjoyed the Parisian theaters. They were really addicted to it, and they both attended it regularly, as did Thomas Jefferson. Of course, there were the other theaters that were built about this time. You may know them. One, of course, is the great theater by Victor Louis in Bordeaux, Ledoux Theater at Besançon, which was 1784, and the Odeon was 1782. And all of this is expressing the revolutionary changes that are occurring at another level of society other than just the mainly political. By the 1780s, when Jefferson went to the Odeon, both the audience and the seating hierarchy had become far more democratic and egalitarian. Before, the theater boxes were owned by the nobility and were passed along as symbols of their owner's position in society. But now, for the first time, the public was beginning to democratically enjoy seats, first come, first served basis. I don't think that this drawing here by the architect of his foyer suggests particularly a democratic audience, if this is the audience that he has placed here so beautifully in the colonnade. and certainly doesn't match up with the audience that turned out actually again in 1784 for the first production of that great revolutionary drama, The Marriage of Figaro. I understand you're going to have a production, the opera itself is going, based on that play, you're going to have it here at the university shortly. This revolutionary drama had a long history of political suppression by the Crown. Everybody was interested in whether it would be put on or whether it wouldn't be. And when it finally opened, the crowds, which could now enter the theater as a member of the public, nearly had a riot trying to get the seats for the opening. And of course, Jefferson was, while he was not there for the opening, he attended one of the early performances as soon as he could get a ticket. There's another area of Jefferson's multifaceted interest that grew during his stay in Paris, and this was the new garden revolution, manifested in garden layouts, not only in Paris, but also then sweeping through France and the rest of the European continent. Nothing quite captures the fashion and the essence of Jefferson's Paris than does the Jardin Anglais, the label the French would attach to their newfound garden mania in the new English garden style. This garden revolution not only transformed the terrain itself, but it also introduced highly experimental architecture in the gardens in the form of ornamental pavilions. The subject of the Jardin Anglais is obviously too large and too complex to explore in depth this evening, but I would like to leave you with one or two tantalizing images. The first one here is the first one is, of course, the plan was of the Déserterettes, and within the Déserterettes there were some 25, 26 wonderful little buildings of all kinds and variety. One of them, which still survives and has been restored within the last 10 or 15 years, of course, is this marvelous pyramid. Jefferson took Maria Causeway on one of their romantic travels around Paris to see the désert. He was absolutely carried away with it, as he was with Maria. And in the woods, there was not only the pyramid, there was this wonderful Chinese pavilion, which has, of course, completely disappeared, but lasted down to World War II. It actually was still there in quite dilapidated form. And when it finally collapsed, people were rather horrified that this great treasure from the 18th century had been allowed to disappear. And André Malraux, who was the Minister of Culture, and because of his great interest in China and the Far East, when he learned about it, he immediately got on the case, and they pushed through a law called the Law Malraux, which basically allows the government, in the most extreme cases where a national treasure is threatened, to actually, against the owner's objection, go into the property 6 months out of the year and stabilize the building or whatever has to be restored. And if the owner doesn't pay for this work, they can actually charge it against the owner, and when the property is ever sold, the government gets its money back with interest. Of course, the central feature of the Déserterettes, and I'm sure many of you have seen this image before, was and is the glorious column house. The conceit, of course, is a classical column, broken column of it's some 80 feet high, but within it, and as you can see there in the window, the openings there, it actually has a four-story house inside. And if the column is actually projected to its full height, before it was a ruin, I believe it comes out to about 300 feet, or would have been a column 300 feet. But it looks like it's right out of a painting by Hubert Robert. It's a romantic vision of the ancient world and immediately appealed to Jefferson's own sensibilities. How grand the idea excited by the remains of such a column, he wrote Maria Causeway after they had visited it. As a devoted horticulturalist and architectural student, Jefferson never missed an opportunity to visit interesting and particularly new gardens both in France and England. Here is a garden pavilion called the Pagode de Chanteloup, based on the design of William Chambers, and it's all that remains of a great 18th century garden near Amboise, which Jefferson actually stopped off to see specifically when he was returning from his wine tour in southern France in 1787. Jefferson listed gardens as important models for Americans to study at every opportunity when they were traveling. Given the horticultural riches of America, he believed that the entire continent of limitless waste could be reconciled with man-made civilization, and its natural landscape turned into an Eden with only a few adjustments in the natural design. Gardens, he wrote in a guide for travelers, particularly worth the attention of an American, because it is the country of all others where noblest gardens can be made without expense. We have only to cut out the superabundant plants. Ignoring Jefferson's characteristic optimism in matters of expense and his optimism in the future of gardening as a noble art in America, I still find this a very worthy and serious civilizing recommendation, not only for Americans today, but particularly for American architects. So with that thought in mind, I would like to close these remarks this evening with Jefferson's own words paying tribute to the French people and their capital. I cannot leave this great and good country without expressing my sense of its preeminence.